A Louisiana man was arrested after violently attacking a police officer during a welfare check. So now officers had found Jonas Reese Crystal sleeping in the parking lot inside of an apartment building in Prairieville. Now, police, of course, checked on him, like, hey, this guy sleeping in the parking lot. I just want to make sure he's okay, right? So this happened at about 1 in the morning. So the guy was intoxicated. And so now when the police went to check on him, the 25-year-old Crystal, once he was woken up, decided to give police fake names and was, quote, very resistive. So after the resistance, and I'm going to explain what that is, he was actually put in a police vehicle and taken to jail. Now, an officer during the arrest had called the man's father, and during that call, Crystal began kicking the inside of the vehicle, kicking the officer in the torso and the arm as he tried to place him in shackles. And while the officer was filling out paperwork, Crystal had made death threats as well as racist and homophobic remarks against the officer, according to police. Crystal was charged with public intoxication, resisting arrest, threatening a public officer, and battery of a police officer. But note that he was still alive after all this happened. And that's kind of the point. This is the reason that I'm talking about this story. This is the difference between being white in America and, talking to police and interacting with the police versus being black in America and doing the same thing. About 24 hours earlier, and about 500 miles west, police responded to a welfare check call, found a black woman standing beside a window in her own home, checking on a noise from a police officer scoping outside after she had been playing video games. And within 4 seconds, they opened fire and killed her. This was Atashiana Jefferson, and she was killed by Fort Worth police. They did not identify themselves as law enforcement officers. 4 seconds. Gun in the house, completely illegal in Texas. They did not identify themselves, and yet she's dead in 4 seconds. All it took. Now, look, here's the thing. These police officers, despite physical threats and attacks, they didn't open fire. And I actually think that's a good thing. I don't think they should have responded in the same way. The problem is that they're completely different rules when it comes to black people versus white people. For example, there's numerous cases of African Americans, unarmed African Americans, and sometimes African Americans that legally carry weapons that they have licensed. Philando Castile was shot and killed in his car. He had a legal firearm. He told the officer that he had a legal firearm, and yet was shot and killed. Whereas you have other instances of white people walking around with guns trained at police officers, yet were not killed. Then you have, of course, unarmed African Americans like Eric Garner, who was choked to death for selling loose cigarettes. In fact, during the time of his arrest and his death, he was not selling loose cigarettes. He was allegedly breaking up a fight. Police murdered him for it. Now, Tamir Rice had a pellet gun. A neighbor or a person in the in the neighborhood called the police. They weren't sure. He had a pellet gun, and they weren't sure if it was a real gun. He was shot and killed within 4 seconds. Sandra Bland, arrested for not using a turn signal, ends up dead in jail 3 days later. Michael Brown, shot and killed for allegedly reaching for an officer's gun. And I say alleged because the gunshot wounds show that he was shot in the back, possibly as he was running away. Freddie Gray, given a nickel ride in a police van after being arrested and died from those injuries. Walter Scott, shot in the back and killed for running away. Cops planted a taser on his body. On and on. This happens. Whether you're armed or you're not armed, it's open season on black people. And yet, when a white shooter goes into a church and kills 25 African Americans, he gets arrested without incident and is taken to a Burger King in order to get a meal. He's feeling a little peckish. after that murder. I know sometimes murder makes me hungry. Look, this is what systemic racism and bias look like. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.